Throughout this series, we've discussed the similarities between Canaan's deities and Israel's God, Yahweh. The purpose of this was to show how culturally close Israel was to Canaan, and there is perhaps no better illustration of this than in their rituals regarding the dead. Welcome to part 5 of our series about the gods of ancient Israel, based on Dr. Mark Smith's The Early History of God. Let's review some of the similarities between Israel's God and those of Canaan's. Yahweh and El were both paternal creators. Yahweh and Baal were both storm gods who rode on clouds and lived on mountains. Yahweh and Anat were both very violent warrior gods. At first, Israel showed a tolerance for the worship of gods like Baal, and its citizens even kept cultic items like Asherahs, which represented the goddess Asherah, in their temples. Gradually, worship of these gods and goddesses, as well as keeping their representations, was condemned by the prophets, but we'll get into the precise history of monotheism of Israel next time. For now, I'll highlight the similarities between Israelite and Canaanite rituals regarding the dead. Mourning, feeding, and even consulting the dead were practiced by both religions, though later these practices were condemned by Israel. Necromancy, or communicating with the dead in particular, was practiced before the mid-8th century in ancient Israel. At some point, it gained a bit more of a negative reputation, which we can see by the way it's portrayed when Saul consulted a necromancer in 1 Samuel chapter 28. By the time Isaiah and Deuteronomy were written, condemnation of necromancy was far more widespread. We also read about the banning of mourning practices, such as cutting the hair and skin of the dead. That said, kings like Manasseh from the 7th century still practiced some of these rituals, and they were prevalent enough for the king Josiah, also from the 7th century, to ban them. Isaiah chapter 57 verses 6 through 7 also mocks feeding the dead and necromancy. Up until the Talmud was written, which I remind you was after Jesus lived and died, there were reports and condemnations of necromancy. There are many reasons the Israelites changed their tone on communicating with the dead, which Mark Smith writes about, but perhaps the most striking transformation occurred regarding their relationship with a particularly morbid practice, child sacrifice. Here in America, the letters MLK refer to Martin Luther King. Over in ancient Israel, though, they carried a very different meaning. The MLK sacrifice, often pronounced Molech or Moloch, is described by Jeremiah in chapter 19 and Psalm 106 as a human sacrifice to Baal. Now, remember how throughout the series we've observed the trend that the Israelites would more or less copy certain elements of Canaanite culture and direct them towards Yahweh? Well, they wouldn't possibly have done this with child sacrifice, right? Well, Ezekiel chapter 20, verses 25 through 26 is a rather unnerving passage that reads, "I, the Lord, gave them, the Israelites, statutes that were not good, and ordinances by which they could not have life. And I defiled them through their very gifts in making them offer by fire all their firstborn, that I might horrify them. I did it that they might know I am the Lord." So, yes, Ezekiel confirms that there were ancient Israelites who practiced child sacrifice. Obviously, this is something ancient Israel was deeply ashamed of, as Jeremiah denies it ever happened. Leviticus condemns such a practice a couple of times, but the fact remains that not only did Israel practice this at some points, but they indeed believed that God told them to do it. Now, it was not uncommon for cultures around this time to practice child sacrifice. North Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, and Spain, just to name a few, all engaged in child sacrifice, and there are panels from the Mediterranean showing exactly how this happened, including priests disguised in animal masks. Pretty horrific practice. When and why did this happen? The historian Philo of Byblos from the 1st century after Christ described how ancient peoples generally reserved this practice for dire times, basically when the entire civilization was at risk. This occurred several times in Kings when Israel's opponents engaged in child sacrifice for their armies. Now, while this practice may have been common in some cultures, archaeological evidence suggests it was not very common in Israelite society. Also, it is worth noting that generally the folks who practiced this were upper-class social elites. And it looks like the prophets had to fight against the Israelite kings to abolish this practice, which eventually they successfully did. Whew. This was a heavy topic, but I've always found it fascinating because it shows just how closely related Israel was in ritual to its neighbors, especially Canaan, to the point at which it even retained violent practices like child sacrifice. It also shows how, at the end of the day, the lowly prophets rise up against the powerful elites and kings, and they win. Next week, we'll finally put the pieces of the puzzle together to establish a timeline of how Israel changed, from tolerating the worship of multiple gods, to asserting Yahweh's authority over all gods, to believing that there is only one God. Until then, have a great day. God bless you.